Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of March of 2023. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Kupiansk front line. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes in the vicinity of Sinkovka, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system Akatsa. Furthermore, the Ukrainians lost 6 commandos groups. They were spotted somewhere in this area and destroyed by the Russians, or at least were forced to step back. As you can see, the Russians continue their operational battle for the Kupiansk front line, but without any progress on the ground. I believe that Ukrainians still have possibilities to cross Oskol River in this area and to send their commandos all over the front line and the Russians. And this tactic by the Ukrainians at least slow down the Russians. And for now, at this stage of this operation, they need to fix the issues with these commandos and spies and all this stuff from the Ukrainian side. Now let's move to Liman front line. As you can see, the Russians continue their strategic battle for the forest in the north of Serebrenka. The Russians continue attacking this area with artillery. As a result of clashes on Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 130 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system Gvozdika. As you can see, the losses from the Ukrainian side are still on the very high level on this front line. But as you can see, also without any changes on the ground, or at least it is very difficult to measure the real position inside of the forest. I believe that maybe the Russians are much closer to the Seversky Donetsk River, but when talking about the settlements, it is easy to understand whether the settlement was taken or not. But when we're talking about the forest, I believe it is very difficult to understand and determine where the Russians or where the Ukrainians. I believe at that moment when the Russians get let's say Seversky Donetsk River or Yampol, we will know this, and they will give us this information, this piece of information, and we will color this, and this map will be colored in red, this forest. When talking about Seversk front line, there are no changes, there are no clashes, there are no movements from both sides. The Western sources are saying, and the Russians confirms, the Ukrainians are moving more and more reserves in direction of Seversk. And if you remember, yesterday we discussed about the deblockade operation of Bakhmut that Ukrainians started, not just have accumulated or have prepared the deblockade operation. The Ukrainians have already started the deblockade operation, and they're attacking the north of Donetsk. These right exactly this even seconds from Slaviansk in direction of Paraskovievka along the this MO3 road. Let's go back to the Western sources map for better picture. So the Ukrainians have already started their attacks along this MO3 road, but some sources are saying that, at least the Russian sources are saying, that Ukrainians have also accumulated another powerful fist in the vicinity on the south of Seversk, and some sources are saying that maybe the Ukrainians will try to attack in direction of Yakovlivka along these fields. I don't believe this information, or at least I understand that it's highly unlikely the Ukrainians are going to do this, because first of all, these fields are mined by the Ukrainian side by themselves. They were mined during the previous period of time, and before this attack, first they need to demine, and they need at least another week to do this, and they need to deblocate Bakhmut right now by attacking on the north. And so some Russian military experts are saying that maybe the Ukrainians will try to attack, as we discussed yesterday, from the line between Privylye, Bandarna in direction of Paraskovievka. This is the first fist of their direction of attack. The second one from the south of Seversk in direction of Yakovlivka. And some sources are saying that the Ukrainians will try to attack from the south. We discussed at least these two operations, that the north one and the south one, and I told you about the south. It's highly unlikely because there are no operational square to deploy tanks, and there is a channel, the water barrier, and first, if you want to attack, you need to deploy and place your tanks on the Russian side of this channel, and after that you can attack. But we see that there are not much square, and the Ukrainians just don't have possibilities to redeploy, to move their tanks and armored vehicles on the Russian side of the channel. So the south attack is highly unlikely that the Ukrainians are going to start, at least the south deblockade attack. If you remember, today during the morning video we discussed about the situation in Gorlovka, that Ukrainians attacked this area since the beginning of March. Maybe if the Ukrainians took a decision to start deblockade operation of Bakhmut, and if they want to start attack from the south, it's there is much more chances that the Ukrainians will try to attack in direction of Gorlovka. As they attack, that will force the Russians to move some reserves to the south, but not from New York Toretsk agglomeration in direction of Bakhmut. There are a lot of barriers on the Ukrainian. They are going on the Ukrainian way, so it's highly unlikely. When talking about attack from Siversk, as I told you, these mines are filled, and there are Solidar that is under Russian control, the road Bilogorovka, the railroad on the west road. There are also lots of barriers, and I don't think that Ukrainians are able to. Yes, they can. The question is, what price the Ukrainians are going to pay for the blockade of Bakhmut. And we know that there are around 12,000 soldiers. Let's assume that around 12,000 soldiers. I don't think that there are around 20, but it's like my feelings, it's speculation, because maybe there are 20,000, who knows. So let's talk about 12,000, but meaning that maybe keeping in our minds that maybe there are 20,000. Everything is possible. So if the Ukrainians, let's say by these blockade operations, are going to lose, let's say 6,000, but they're able to deblockade Bakhmut, maybe it's like worth it. But if they're going to lose all their armored vehicles and not to deblocate, I don't think that it's worth it. Anyway, the Ukrainians need to calculate everything. They need to be very careful with this operation, and they need to understand. Of course, they need to do something, because 12,000 army encircled in Bakhmut is a tragedy, is a disaster for the Ukrainian society, and for the Ukrainian military authorities. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians, when talking about Donetsk front line, and as we discussed during the morning video, Donetsk front line starts at Siversk and ends at Marinka. During these clashes all over the front line, the Ukrainians lost 180 soldiers, 10 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks, and 2 artillery systems. As if you remember, if you compare the numbers with the previous day, the Ukraine lost just 75. So yes, the Russians have a small operational pause, and and we discussed, and as I understand that situation was tightly connected with the thing that the Ukrainians left the east bank of the Bakhmutka river and they stepped back into the central and the western part, and that's why the Russians needed time to clear this area, to establish their positions, to demine this area. So of course it takes time, and that's why the level of the Russians attacks of their pressure was reduced by that. So that was the real reason why, that was the reason why the losses of the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours was on such a low level. And as you can see, the Western sources map has been updated now. There shows that they show that the eastern part is under Russian control, but I would like to add that according to the Russian sources, according to the information we have from the Russian sources, this south part is also under Russian control. And this is very important because these completely two different pictures, and let's color this territory in red for better understanding of the situation. So this area is under Russian control, and if you remember, I told you many videos ago when we split Bakhmut in many parts, where we tried to determine which part the Russians are able to take with the normal level of losses, and which part they are not able to take because of high level of losses. And I told you that as soon as the Russians are able to take the south part, it's some kind of gates or door to develop their offensive operation to the south. And if you remember, these blocks on the south were colored in red as their territory that the Russians are able to take, and they are able to get right to the central street, big streets in this area. So there are always problems in any town to cross big wide streets. So this is wide streets, and the Russians, I believe, and they have already started these offensive operations. Like to the north, it's like the Budyonovka area and this area, so they can take them, and I believe that they will continue their pressure in this area. Furthermore, as you can see, the Russian source map has been updated on the north, and this small block by the name of Ilyanovka, I believe. So as you can see, this territory is also colored in red, and now there is a front line goes along the small river, and when talking about this area was colored in yellow during the previous videos, and this is industrial zone that the Russians, I believe, highly likely are able to take. They will try to encircle from the south or to force the entire Ukrainian army to step back from Bakhmut at once. So something like this. So as you can see, the level of losses is higher than yesterday, so that means that the Russians activated one more time and started movements, their movements on the eastern part, and also the configuration structure of Ukrainian losses when talking about armored vehicle losses also have been changed. The thing is that I see that it's second day in a row when the Ukrainians are losing tanks, a lot of tanks. For example, yesterday the Ukrainians on Donetsk front line lost just 7 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks, and today the Ukrainians lost 10 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks as well. What does it mean? That means that the Ukrainians started deblocade operation, and as we discussed, they don't have time for preparation. Every single day is very important because there are soldiers that need to use weapon, ammo, and they need to fight with the Russians trying to stop. So that's why the Ukrainians need to bring more and more reserves, reinforcements, ammo, and shell inside of Bakhmut. If they're not doing this, then the garrison in Bakhmut losing their position. So that's why they don't have months to prepare the blockade operation. They don't have even days. The Ukrainians have maybe hours, maybe minutes to start the blockade operation, and as I told you, they have already started, and the losses of the tanks have been increased. And the second day in a row, that for 2 days the Ukrainians lost 4 tanks. But as you can see, the level of losses among the light armored vehicles have been reduced, and the main reason, as I understand, the Ukrainians, as soon as they took a decision not to step back from Bakhmut, they took a decision to use carefully the vehicles and not to, maybe not if they are not retreating, that means that they're not using light vehicles, and that means that they're not losing them. So I connect all these things, and I found this explanation for myself, the situation that goes and works around the Bakhmut or something like this. As you can see, the Wagners are not developing their bridgehead. There are heavy clashes in Verekhovo-Vasilievka, Dubovo-Vasilievka, Bogdanovka, Ivanovska. All these towns is under high Russian pressure, but without any progress on the ground. So the Russians are just pushing and trying to find the weak position of the Ukrainians, and as soon as they understand that times come, they will start their greatest offensive operation. They will collapse Bakhmut at once. But for now, they don't have such possibilities, at least till the end of Ukrainians' deblocade operation from the north. And after that, I believe they will be able to do at least anything. Now let's move to the south and let's talk about Avdiivka, and let's return back to the Russian sources map. As you can see, this is another strategical battle in Ukraine, not just Bakhmut. This is, I believe, maybe even more important than Bakhmut, but we don't see a lot of progress here because this area is completely and heavily fortified. So that's why there are no progress. There are not much piece of news and piece of information about that the Russians are taking territory. So there is no material for media to show to the world press, to people all over the world. So that's why we don't see a lot of updates. But believe me, the clashes on this front line even maybe heavier than in Bakhmut. But we don't see this because nobody showed this information to us. But today the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on the north of Avdiivka, for Novobakhmutovka, Krasnogorovka, Veselaya, and these fortification in the forest, the Russians established control over Veselaya, and this information today was confirmed by the Ukrainian sources. So now let's return back to the Western sources map. As you can see, even from this configuration, we see that Avdiivka is half encircled, and there are not much places that Ukrainians are able to use to supply and support Avdiivka. So let's update this map according to information we have. The Russians established control over Veselaya, and to understand what is the main reason of the Russians. Anyway, the Ukrainians still have possibility to support Krasnogorovka from many sides, from the north, from the south. So I don't think that operation to establish control over Veselaya is the operation that the Russians made to get control over Krasnogorovka, because to tell the truth, this is the most important town in this area, and by taking Krasnogorovka, the Russians will be able to cut at least the north support. I believe that Veselaya is the key to establish control over these small villages that located in the south of Veselaya. It's Kamyanka and this area, and this is some kind of residential area. Let's return back to the Russian source map. I'm talking about this Kamenka and these small buildings that people uses during spring or something like this. There are two powerful fortifications, but by the taking of Veselaya, the Russians now are able to at least maybe to establish control maybe they're able to go a little bit to the south, moving along these forest lines to establish control over this cross, because for now this is one of the most important area when talking about Kamyanka fortification area. So if the Russians are able to establish physical control, and it's not a difficult job, as you can see, there is a water reservoir from the south, and there is a water reservoir from the north, and there is a very short road that Ukrainians are able to use using the local roads to support the forces and fortifications in Kamyanka and the territory village on the south, these two. So if the Russians can go a little bit to the south, they can cut this road, and then they will be able to short their own front line and to get control over Kamyanka in this area, and by that they will get as close as possible and will be able to establish the front line along these water reservoirs and the river, and then we are going to see something like this. And of course this is completely different picture, because Avdiivka will be get more and more deeper inside the encirclement. Furthermore, don't forget, if you saw the morning's video, that the Russians attacks these black heavily with artillery, and this is the black that faced the Russian FAB 500 and UAB controlled Avia bombs, 1,500 kilos in this area. This area is ruined totally, and I believe that the Russians are not going to keep even a single building. They will ruin everything. They will reduce everything to ruins, and this is the only block that slowed down the Russians in their movements to the south, to Severna and Toninka. These two areas is not heavy fortified. As I understand, the Ukrainians thought or maybe believed that the Russians can't or wasn't able to establish control over Peski, Oputne, and so that's why they, even if you take a look at this map, there are blue lines in this area that shows that shows the fortification of the ground. You see these trenches and so on, and as you can see, there are no blue lines around Severna and Toninka. Yes, I believe that there are fortifications along these forest lines, some trenches and so on, but these two towns are not protected. The Ukrainians maybe didn't have enough time, or they didn't think that the Russians are able to get there. So this is not these towns is not so difficult, are not so difficult to take. But the problem is this residential area in Avdiivka, and the Russians continues their offensive operation. As you can see, there are also a lot of icons in this area. These 3 AK-47 guns that shows the Russian movements in direction of Severna. So I'm not saying that they're moving right exactly in this area from this direction. Furthermore, as you can see, this map is not updated, because according to the Western sources map, according to the Russian source map, according to the deployment map, according to Institute of Study of War map, this territory that I will mark in red cloud is under Russian control. So the Russians are moving to the north, and they're pretty successful. Yes, they're not so fast as Wagner's, but of course we need to understand that we can't there are different amount of forces from both sides on this front line and on that front line. Furthermore, when talking about the Ukrainians, mainly the Russians are trying to destroy the ammo depots and positions of 110th Territorial Defense Brigade that these days are deployed in Avdiivka. So battle for Avdiivka has started, and I must say that for now I can't tell you about the losses from the Russians. I don't have this information, but I see that for now, very slowly, step by step, but situation goes and develops in Russian favor. We'll see, maybe at some certain point, let's say as soon as the Russians take controls over these clouds, we will no longer able to develop in direction of Krasnogorovka, and if the Russians take Severna and Toninka, they won't be able to develop further to Orlovka, and they will stuck, and all their attempts will be like useless or something like this. But for now, everything develops in their favor. Now let's move to the south and let's talk about Marinka. As you can see, there are no changes. About Donetsk is under very heavy fire. If you remember, this morning we discussed also the patterns of Ukrainian attacks, and as you can see, their attacks, the first line of Russian reserves, not the central part, but so maybe there was I don't know, very difficult to judge and very difficult to understand about this attack. But anyway, we saw the pattern that Ukrainian uses when attacking Donetsk, and every time they're really targeting something, and they're attacking just the same places, just the same 4 there are at least, when on the north part of Donetsk, there are at least 4 places that Ukrainians attacks usually and regularly, and now they're doing the same. So they're trying to find something and to destroy something in this area. They're not just attacking like because they want it or they can. Now let's talk about South Donetsk area. As you can see, the battle for the South Donetsk area continues. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 65 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles, including 1 tank and 1 artillery system Stab B. If we are talking about the 2 days, the previous 2 days, today and the yesterday, the Ukrainians lost 6 tanks just for 2 days of clashes. So this is a very high level of losses. They still haven't received the Western tanks, and they start losing their own tanks, and so that means something. For now, I can't tell exactly what does it mean, and just losses, but anyway, that means something. When talking about Zaporozhye, there are no changes, just another icon on the biggest accumulation of forces between Gulyai-Polye and Velika Novoselovka. If you remember the morning's video, there was like also a lot of icons showing that there are very high concentration of forces from both sides in this area, and both sides are trying to do something with the opening forces. This, let's say, Vremivka salient that is controlled by the Russians, maybe is possible direction of Ukrainian counteroffensive operation just to short the front line and to move the Russians as far as possible from this salient. When talking about Kherson, there are just one update, but the Russians on these icons, just one icon, but the Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost another 50 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system D30. As you can see, in comparison with the previous day, the losses among the armored vehicles have been reduced, but maybe because the fact that today is a holiday in Russia, I don't know, can't explain to you. Anyway, I see that these few days, today and yesterday, the Russians' activity on the front lines have been reduced in comparison with the previous days. Maybe by the fact that they completed the encirclement operational encirclement, the tactical encirclement of Bakhmut, and they take a small decision to regroup because they have some time for this. And tomorrow we'll see if they're going to restart the process and to increase the pressure one more time. Very difficult to understand, but anyway, we see what we see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.